Hello, I'm Susan L. Allen, National President and CEO of the U.S. Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce Education Foundation, talking to you from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Live Talk. This is our 29th Live Talk since we started this program in March 2020. That was when COVID-19 hit America and the world. Today, we have a very special guest with us from NASA, talking to you about funding opportunities for all Americans, including Asian American and other minorities who want to get some funding from NASA on research and development. US PAC has a long-standing relationship with NASA. I started with NASA many years ago when I sat on their MBRAC, Minority Business Resource Committee, for 4 years. And NASA former administrator Sean O'Keefe came and spoke as a keynote speaker for our national annual dinner, the Excellence Award, when we had one of many Asian American astronauts, Leroy Chiao, speaking from space to us. And later, I had the privilege of meeting astronaut Kalpana Chawla, who went into space. And I met her in the White House, in the Oval Office, before she launched. Unfortunately, we lost her in space. NASA CTO also spoke at our conference in Houston, and many other activities that put us in very close touch with NASA. And the CTO was Ronnie Clayton. He was the Johnson Space Center Deputy Chief Technologist. I'd like to introduce to you Chris Murguia. He is the Senior Analyst of Grants Policy and Compliance at the NASA Headquarters Office of Procurement. Welcome, Chris. Tell us, what does NASA do besides shooting rockets into the space?
First of all, thank you, Ms. Allen, and thank you, US PAC, for hosting me today. It's an honor to be speaking with you all this afternoon. To get to your question, what does NASA do besides launching rockets into space? The answer is we do many things. But what many people don't realize is that beyond funding those projects that you see in the news every day, such as the James Webb Space Telescope that we just launched last year, or the Artemis mission, that is our next mission to put the first woman and next man on the moon. Besides funding those projects, we also fund a lot of research here on Earth. We spend about $1.3 billion every year funding fundamental research in areas such as planetary sciences, earth sciences, biology, chemistry, aeronautics, engineering. You name it, NASA's most likely funding research in that area of focus.
NASA is part of the federal government, and you belong to the Office of Procurement. In my decade of experience working as the full-time CEO and national president of US PAC, I learned that there are these two types of instruments to work with the federal government in obtaining funding to do good work in the commercial sector. I understand there are cooperative agreements and grants. Mm-hmm. What are the differences between the two instruments?
Great question. So before I describe the differences between grants and cooperative agreements, I first want to describe what a contract is so that the audience knows what the difference is between a contract and a grant and cooperative agreement. So the contract in the federal government, a contract is what we use to procure goods and services for the direct benefit of the federal government. Contracts differ from grants and cooperative agreements in that a grant or cooperative agreement is used to provide funding to benefit a public entity. So the federal government is not allowed to use grants or cooperative agreements to procure goods or services for ourselves. We must use grants and cooperative agreements to provide funding to the public to support a project that they are implementing themselves. And I'll also add to that in addition to having different purposes between grants and cooperative agreements, grants are governed by regulations that are different from the regulations that govern contracts. So contracts are governed by the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR, and grants and cooperative agreements, on the other hand, are governed by Title II of the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, specifically, or most notably, Part 200, so 2 CFR 200.
Mm-hmm. Chris, many of our members are federal contractors and they understand federal contracts. And we do also receive grants from the federal government. So we are sort of familiar with grants. As to some of our audience, they may not know the qualification requirements, if any, that's different from contracts that they should know about in order to compete. Are there such special requirements?
Absolutely. So in order to compete for a federal grant cooperative agreement from NASA or for any other agency, you have to register in certain systems. If any member of the public is interested in a grant funding opportunity from any federal agency, the first place they should look is grants.gov. Grants.gov is where all federal grant funding agencies need to post their funding opportunities for the public to see. Right, so if you're interested in a competitive grant funding opportunity, the first thing I recommend is taking a look at grants.gov and creating an account within that system. In addition to grants.gov, NASA has its own grant system called Inspires. Inspires is the NASA Solicitation and Proposal Integrated Review and Evaluation System. Inspires. This system is much like grants.gov in that NASA uses it to publish our grant funding opportunities. We also use Inspires to receive or intake grant proposals if there happens to be an opportunity that someone is interested in applying for. So in order to apply to a grant at NASA, you also need to obtain an account in Inspires. Next, the third system that I'll mention besides grants.gov and Inspires, the system called SAM.gov. And your stakeholders who are contract recipients will likely be familiar with SAM.gov because federal contractors have to register in SAM as well. But like our contractors, our grant recipients also need to register in SAM.gov. And what SAM.gov does is it ensures that the federal government is not working with any entities that are not allowed to do business with the federal government. It essentially checks entities against exclusions records. So,
very helpful. Chris, are there any misconceptions about doing business with NASA that people should be aware of?
Yes, there are. So there are misconceptions about federal grants in general, and then there are misconceptions about doing grants business with NASA. So first, I'd like to touch on misconceptions about grants in general. The first misconception that we see a lot is that grants are "quote unquote" free money, that there are no strings attached money. Unfortunately, there are some requirements that all federal grant and cooperative agreement recipients must comply with. We try to make those requirements as less burdensome as possible, but there are still requirements. And those requirements, for example, are reporting requirements. For example, if a grant recipient, if an entity receives a grant from NASA, they'll have to submit reports every quarter to the agency. They'll have to submit various financial reports, various performance reports to the agency. So grants aren't free money. There are some strings attached. That's one of the common misconceptions about receiving a grant from the USG. Another common misconception that I've seen is this idea that for-profit entities cannot receive a grant, which is not true. For-profit entities can absolutely receive a grant if they're eligible for a specific grant opportunity. NASA, we actually issue grants to for-profits all the time. We have grants with large companies such as Boeing or Blue Origin. And we also have grants with small businesses, for-profit small businesses. So in addition to those misconceptions about federal grants in general, there are some misconceptions about grants and NASA. Most members of the public think that all of the grants that we issue are for space research. The majority of the grants that we issue are for space-related research, but we also have grants that aren't related to space research at all. So for example, NASA invests a lot of money into climate change research. We're interested, for example, on the effects of rising seas on our coast, right? Because part of our mission is not only exploring space, but it's protecting the Earth. So we invest a lot of money in climate change research. We also invest a lot of money in aeronautics research and engineering research. So not everything that we do is necessarily space related.
Yeah, Chris, we know how rigorous our reporting activities are whenever we receive a grant from the federal government. It is quite enormous
Right.
because I think the issue, I want to make sure that we're using the taxpayers' money properly and produce the required result that we promise that
Exactly.
we would produce when we apply for the grant. So it is quite a regimen. Quarterly report, financial report, narrative activity, and impact report now.
Right.
We also want to give them the demographics and the number. It's really a rigorous process. Thank you for sharing that. As to budget, is there a budget set aside for cooperative agreements and grants at NASA?
Yes, there is. So NASA's overall annual budget, or total annual budget, floats between about $23 billion and $25 billion a year. So it varies. In this current fiscal year, FY23, our budget is $25 billion. The Biden administration just put forward their budget request for FY24. We're asking for $27 billion. Whether or not we'll get that, it depends on Congress, of course. Right now, our overall budget is $25 billion. Of that $25 billion, we obligate about $1.3 billion for grants every year.
Great. Now, here at USPAC, we started 38 years ago when there was no organization that represented the growing Asian American business community. So we're very much about the Pan-Asian American business community. And when we talk about Pan-Asian, we really mean like the frying pan from rim to rim. Asian, Pacific, and South Asian Americans from across the Pacific Ocean, all the way across the continental United States to the Indian Ocean and Indian subcontinent. So we are a very large and fast-growing community, and very robust, and are into every corner of American society. Since our founding, although we call ourselves Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce, many other ethnic groups are also coming in, reaching out to us, and we also reach out to them in a very extensive manner, working with the Black Chambers of Commerce, with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, with the Women Enterprise System, Women Business Organization, the folks with disabilities, the veterans, and the LGBT community as well. So for Asian Americans, however, usually we feel that we are the last thought in the national agenda. Can I ask you, in NASA's term, how much grants have or cooperative agreements, to your knowledge, that the Pan-Asian American or AAPI community have been receiving so far?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's a very, very small number of NASA's grants that have gone to Asian American-owned small businesses over the last several years. If we look at the data for all awards, by awards I mean contracts, grants, cooperative agreements issued to Asian American-owned small businesses, over the last 3 fiscal years, it averaged to about 149 unique contracts, grants, and cooperative agreements. Of those 149 contracts, grants, cooperative agreements, only about 16 of those were actually grants that were issued to Asian American-owned small businesses. So as you can see, NASA has a lot of work to do in terms of outreach to Asian American-owned small businesses in order to make them aware of the various funding opportunities that they might be eligible for. And I can although the number of grants that we've issued to Asian American-owned small businesses is relatively low, I think some of the projects that we have funded are quite interesting. If you don't mind, I can highlight a few of those. So, for example, we recently funded a grant with an entity based in California called DM3D. And what they are doing is conducting research into 3D printing using metal. Right, so normally 3D printing is done using plastics, but they're exploring 3D printing using metal. Again, this is an Asian American-owned small business. Another project, for example, is a project we funded with an entity called Fathom Science. They're based out of North Carolina. Again, this is Asian American-owned small business. We provided them a grant in the $500,000 range for conducting research on how changing ocean currents will impact the nation's fisheries. So again, this is an example of research that's not related to space, right? This is research on how climate change essentially is impacting the American economy, specifically food security.
Great. Well, that's why we have this program here today, Chris, and to tell the Asian American community that there are lots of opportunities at NASA in research and activities. So please pay attention and go to the grants.gov, STEM.gov, and the other aspire.gov, and find out all the information you need to know. If not, call Chris.
Sure, absolutely.
I'll call you as fact, then you know how to find us, and then that's all that opportunity for you to explore, exploit, and do whatever you want to make sure you get to that level of opportunity that you can throw your head in and try it out. I think for NASA, based upon what Chris has said to us today, the door is open. I think when you want getting there, you find the water will be very fine for you, Asian Americans, and all other minority businesses as well. In recent years, our country has been talking a lot about STEM, making sure our next generation of leaders will also focus on STEM research and studies. What has NASA do to encourage from high school to graduate level students to get into the STEM setting?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And so NASA is committed to investing in STEM education and STEM outreach across the country. We actually have an entire part of our organization that's dedicated to STEM outreach. They're called the Office of STEM Engagement. And just for everyone's background, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. So the Office of STEM Engagement has a number of programs, a few that I'd like to highlight today because they target minority-serving institutions. And at NASA, minority-serving institutions, or MSI, are a type of institution of higher education that services specific groups. So for example, historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, is a type of MSI. ANAPISIs, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, are a type of MSI. So when I say MSI, I'm talking about these types of institutions of higher education. One program that the Office of STEM Engagement has that targets minority serving institutions is called the Minority University Research and Education Program, or MUREP. And under MUREP, it's a broad umbrella program. Under MUREP, there are several funding opportunities. One is called MIRO. If you could tell, NASA, we love our acronyms. So this project MIRO is the MUREP Institutional Research Opportunity. And what MIRO does is it provides funding to minority-serving institutions that are interested in building a research center at their entity. So for example, we recently issued a grant to Prairie View A&M University in Texas. It's an HBCU, and they were able to establish a center that focused on researching the effects of radiation on humans, right? So the effects of radiation on humans that are traveling into space. So again, this is a funding opportunity specifically for minority-serving institutions. Another opportunity that I like to highlight is called the MSTAR program. MSTAR stands for MUREP Space Technology Artemis Research Program. What MSTAR is essentially a capacity building grant for minority serving institutions. What we found is that some MSIs have trouble competing for NASA contracts or NASA grants because they don't have the courses or the academic programs set up at their institutions to be competitive. So what MSTAR does is it provides funding to an institution to set up a course in, say, astrophysics, for example, if they don't have a course in astrophysics. And once they get those courses in astrophysics set up, maybe down the road, they'll be more competitive for a grant or a contract from NASA.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. So now we know NASA does a lot more than sending rockets and shuttles into space.
Exactly.
We also noticed, Chris, that NASA's budget has been increasing slowly over the years, at least much more than when I was on the Minority Business Resource Committee. For 2022, can you tell us what are your department's greatest accomplishments?
What are department's greatest accomplishments? So for NASA in general, I think our greatest accomplishments was our Artemis 1 mission. So that's So the Artemis program is the program we have to send the next woman and first man to the moon. We took a big leap on that program last year by testing the rocket, which is called the Space Launch System, and then the capsule that sits on top of that rocket, which is called Orion. That was a major milestone for the agency as a whole. And narrowing it down to the grants environment at NASA, one of our major accomplishments was instituting a barrier analysis to better understand why certain underserved communities might not be receiving grants and cooperative agreements from NASA. So what we did to conduct that barrier analysis is we released a request for information that went out to the public to collect information on what might be preventing them from competing for NASA opportunities. We then held several town halls with the public to also speak with our stakeholders one-on-one to learn about these barriers. So I would say overall agency-wide, Artemis 1 was a major accomplishment. For grants, I would say this barrier analysis that we've conducted, it was incredibly enlightening and insightful, and we're actually instituting new programs down the road based on this barrier analysis we conducted last year.
How about into the future? What do you hope to accomplish in 2023?
And so for me in the Office of Procurement, what we hope to accomplish is more outreach events to underserved communities. So we're conducting talks like this one. I'll flag an Ask NASA event that we'll be holding on March 29th. It's a live event open to the public. This Ask NASA event is specifically targeted at minority serving institutions who have never received a grant or cooperative agreement from NASA. So we'll be walking these entities through funding opportunities and what they would need to do in order to potentially receive a grant or cooperative agreement from the agency. So that's one of the things I'm looking forward to this year.
Great, Chris. Well, you have given us a lot more information, educated us, and given us reason to reach out and look for information about opportunities for grant and research at NASA. Any other final thoughts?
I would say thank you again, Ms. Allen. Thank you again, US PAC, for hosting me. It was a pleasure speaking with you today. And again, if you take away one thing from this talk is, if you're interested in grant cooperative agreement opportunities, again, visit grants.gov, visit the NASA Inspires website. We post literally hundreds of funding opportunities to these websites each year, and they're not all for space research. So some of them might apply to you sitting at home listening today. Please take a look at those. Also, if you have a chance, you can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. You are one nice, smart, and intelligent and informative, most importantly, representative of NASA. We cannot thank you enough for sharing this last half hour with us. Before we close, I want to tell you that our Celebration Business Plus Procurement Conference 2023 theme Breakthrough will be held in Las Vegas from June 6th to 8th. In Las Vegas, come and join us. And for more information, go to www.uspaacc.com. See you then.